Thanks, Emma, very much. Good morning, everyone. Great to be with you. I get introduced in lots of ways, but lovely. I'll take lovely. The lovely Ken. I'm married to Sue. For those of you who don't know us, we're part of Rock+Redeemer. We love being part of this church. I've said before that when we're not here, it's not that we're bunking off or skipping a church. I work for a charity, a Christian charity that supports churches all around the country called LICC. All around the UK. I say all around the UK. We're going overseas on our next trip. We're going to the Isle of Wight in a week or so. That counts as overseas for me. And in choosing a subject today, I wanted to recognise, like Emma said, that we are just post-Easter, which means that just last week we thought about a journey alongside millions, actually billions of others around the world, of Christians on this planet, thinking about what Easter meant. And that may have crept upon you, or it may have been something you were thinking about all the way through Lent. No judgment here. Either way, it's something for us to reflect on. So I'm going to be reading to us, which is in Colossians 1, 9 to 12, which for me is a really good way to respond to what we've been thinking about over Easter. Colossians 1, 9 to 12 says this. For this reason, since the day we heard about you, we've not stopped praying for you. We continually ask God to fill you with the knowledge of his will through all wisdom and understanding that the Spirit gives, so that you may live a life worthy of the Lord and please him in every way, bearing fruit in every good work, growing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, so that you may have great endurance and patience, and giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of his holy people in the kingdom of light. So like I say, Easter may have crept up on you, or it may be something you were thinking about all the way through Lent, but along with billions of others, we've thought about the journey up to the cross, the pain of the cross, the sacrifice of what Jesus did, the love that's involved in it, the determination of the cross. One of my favourite words in the Easter readings is Jesus resolutely set out, the determination of it. And then we thought about the win of the cross, the resurrection, the miracle of it last Easter Sunday, and then the transformation that Easter brings. So then for a message today, if we've investigated and contemplated and celebrated the greatest event that the planet has ever known last week, so then what difference does that make this week, in the week you're about to face? So now what? The resurrection is not the end of the story, it's your invitation to join in the story. So it makes sense to ask, how do we carry any of that into Asda, if you've got some shopping to do after this service, or into the school gate tomorrow morning, or into your workplace, whatever your work looks like, whether you want to be there or not, or into your home, or into our worship, and into the whole of our lives. Easter demands a response from us. Not that we do any response so that we earn what Jesus has offered through the cross. It's freely given, but it cost him everything. So how do we, his followers, then respond with love to what's on offer? How do we walk along the path with him rather than just adjacent to him? To pick up the message that Ruth felt led to bring to us, rightly so. And this prayer in Colossians, for me, is a good way to do that. So for me, just to frame this letter and this prayer for us, I'll say something about the letter, just briefly, something about the chapter, and then something about the words in this chapter. So this is a letter to the people in Colossians, the church in Colossae. And Paul is in prison when he writes this letter. And Paul hasn't been to Colossae as far as we know. He didn't start up this church. So somebody called Epaphras probably did start the church, because verse 7 says you learnt about Jesus through Epaphras. But Epaphras definitely tells Paul about what's going on in the church. So Paul writes this letter to encourage the church there not to be distracted And that may be a lesson and a message that loads of us need, because it's clear that they are faithfully getting lots of things right, but they're also under pressure for their faith. And for lots of reasons they're under pressure, but one of the reasons is they're under Roman rule. If they're following a king, it's because Caesar is treated as a king in that sense. And in Colossae, there's loads of other gods who are all responsible for different things. And there's a temptation just to add the following to Jesus to all these other gods that are being followed. So what Paul is writing is, keep going. You're on the right track. Keep going. God is in control. And stay true to Jesus. And one of the ways he does that, and I've only noticed this year, is with some so-that's. So he writes, and we're going through Romans at the moment as a church mostly, and Romans is famous for its therefores. I don't know if you know that, but they're there every so often, and there's a thing about whenever there's a therefore, you ask what the therefore is there for, and that's all the way through Romans. But Colossians has loads of so-that's, and there's one in this verse here, in the prayer. The prayer all leads to that so that in verse 10. But I was looking at them just recently, and there's a whole bunch of them I really love. So Colossians 1 verse 11 is there so that you may have great endurance and patience. Colossians 1:18, he is the head of the body, the church, he's the beginning and the end, so that in everything he may have supremacy. That's why we're worshipping him as king. Colossians 1:28, so that we may present everyone fully mature in Christ. Colossians 2:4, so that no one may deceive you by fine-sounding arguments. Colossians 4:6, so that you may know how to answer everybody. Those tricky questions you get because you're in a minority in Colossae. Other people have other beliefs in other gods. I think that would make a really good series sometime. I'm trying to get the charity that I work for to work on them. So that's the letter that we're in. And then if you want to home into this particular chapter, a bit about this chapter is that from verse 15 onwards, not the bit I read, it has one of the most powerful statements in the whole Bible about who Jesus is. And you can picture the context of that when they are against all of these other gods that the people in Rome are telling them that they should be worshipping. And in that context, it's got a chapter saying, a poem basically, a hymn almost, saying how unique our God is. So from verse 19, for God was pleased to have in him, Jesus, the fullness dwell, and through him to reconcile all things to himself. All things, whether these things on earth or in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Basically, if you want the verses in the Bible that have the highest descriptions of who Jesus is, you go to John 1, in the beginning was the Word, you go to Colossians 1, and you go to Hebrews 1. They're like the main statements of who Jesus is, like the supremacy of Jesus. So, against this background of all sorts of beliefs in all sorts of other gods in Rome, where you go to one God for protection, and you go to another God for fertility, and you go to another God for the weather, and you go to another God for guidance, and you go to another God for creation, you need to hear that poem in chapter 1 in terms of all of the alls it says, because our God is the God of all of the everys it said, because our God is the God of everything. You with me so far? At least 3 of you are. Great. Let's proceed on that basis. So let me read to you that poem and just hear the uniqueness of the Jesus that we've been celebrating this last week. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. For God was pleased to have his fullness dwell in him, and so on. So that when you read that, you get the view that our God is the God of all, and therefore all of our life matters to him. not just bits of our life. It all matters to him. And then that relates to our prayer, particularly verses 9 and 10. We continually ask God to fill you with the knowledge of his will through all wisdom and understanding that the Spirit gives, so that you may live a life worthy of the Lord and please him in every way, bearing fruit in every good work, growing in the knowledge of God. Every good work. So what is our response to Easter last week? In this verse, it's to do with bearing fruit in every good work. So it's to do with trying to be fruitful in our lives. Now, I work for a charity called LICC, the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity. You use their resources that I was part of putting together over Christmas, called Down to Earth. But if you've ever come across our resources before, and it doesn't matter if you have or haven't, there's no judgment, you're welcome either way, you'll know that we talk a lot about fruitfulness. So we've got a resource called Fruitfulness on the Front Line, with pictures of trees on it. We'll often talk about the 6 M's of fruitfulness. And we've got a resource with another image of trees on it called Growing on the Front Line, which our home group, the Leighton Buzzard home group for Rock+Redeemer, have done, and got roots and trees and fruitfulness on it. At the end of all of that, you could think, what is it about LICC and fruitfulness? They're just obsessed with fruit and with trees. To which I would say, it's not actually our obsession, it's the Bible's obsession. The Bible just goes on and on about fruitfulness. So just to give you an example, and this isn't an exhaustive list, there are fruit trees in the first chapter of the Bible, and they're called to be fruitfulness. There's the tree of life bearing fruit in the last chapter of the Bible. And in between all of that, trees are the most mentioned living thing, other than human beings, in the whole Bible. And when we consider fruitfulness throughout the Bible, it becomes clear that fruitfulness means much more than just fruit to eat or reproducing and increasing our population. We're made to be fruitful in all aspects of our lives, in everything that we do. And so then, as you go through the Old Testament, there are Bible passages that recognize how God's people have fallen short of being fruitful. And then there are passages that call us back to living fruitfully. And then there are prophecies of fruitfulness to come. And then Jesus comes, and he too describes himself as the vine, and we're the branches, and we are to bear fruit. And he also warns that you'll be able to tell false and true prophets by their fruit. And then Paul comes, and he picks up this theme with the fruit of the Spirit. He says that we should display the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, goodness, faithfulness, and self-control. And then our passage, which is this beautiful prayer, contains this word that we should be fruitful in every way, in every good work. Notice the 2 everys in that sentence: in every way and in every good work. So one thing about, we've covered the thing about the whole letter, covered a thing about this chapter. So then let's consider what this actual verse means. If we're going to pray it for each other as a response to Easter, what does it mean to be fruitful in every good work? Well, first of all, part of it, I think, is to combat whatever society's view of fruitfulness is. If you're a Christian in Colossae at the time, there'd be a view that Rome is fruitful, because fruitful means successful, and it means militarily successful. So if you want to be fruitful, just be loyal to Rome, loyal to the powers that be, follow the gods that they tell you to, and that will show you fruitfulness. Look at the buildings we've got. Look at the army we've got. Look at the money we've got. That's fruitful. And against that background, the rest of this verse says, fruitful is to live with knowledge of his will, to live with endurance and patience, giving joyful thanks to the Father for the inheritance of his holy people in the kingdom of light. It's a different view of fruitfulness. I just want to say something about, in the context of that, for those of you who are trying to live fruitfully, in a context where you don't particularly want to be where you are at the moment. And nevertheless, somebody's standing at the front here today telling you to go and be fruitful tomorrow. I can't ignore the fact that it's London Marathon Day. And I can safely refer to marathons because Henry's not here to tell us that he ran a marathon a couple of weeks ago. Did anyone watch some of the London Marathon before coming out to church today? Some of you admitting that you did. There's always that tune that plays that stays in my head, which I won't try and hum for you afterwards. And I may have said this before, but whenever I see the marathon, I think of a couple of people I've read about who have ran the marathon by mistake. So there was a guy, he was 26, his name was Mike Kohler, and he entered the half marathon. It wasn't the London Marathon, but it was one of those events where you can run the half marathon or the marathon. People running the half marathon, they turn up later, but Mike Kohler isn't that sort of person. I'm like Mike in that sense, not in the sense of running, but in the sense of getting to places early. So he got there early, and he didn't know he was with the marathon runners, not the half marathon runners. So he's running, and he gets to the point where he should turn around, and there's no option to turn around. He's never run the marathon before, he's 26, and he says to himself, I'm already here, I'm already running, I'm already tired, so I might as well keep going. And he completes the marathon in, I think, like 5.5 hours. They almost didn't give him a medal because he hadn't entered it. And then loads and loads of other people complained and he got his medal, which is great. But that's not the most extreme example of this I've ever heard. So looking that up, I looked it up, and there's a woman called Georgine Johnson, and the same thing happens to her, except for she entered the 10K. So she's 42. She's never run a marathon before, or a half marathon. She gets there so early that she's in the marathon with the elite runners. And nobody notices. So she's in the marathon with the elite runners. And she's running. She gets to the 5K point where she thinks she could turn around. She's no longer with the elite runners, by the way. But she's still running with some other people. She sidles up somebody next to her because there's no room to turn. She says, "This is the 10K, isn't it?" And they say, "No, it's the marathon." And she begins to cry. And then she goes up to a policeman who's stewarding, and she says to the policeman, can you maybe get me back, like in your car, to the start, and I'll just run the 10K. That'll be 15K. I can probably do that. And he says, I don't have a car, and look at the crowds. That's just not possible. So she then says to herself this. She says, this isn't the race I entered. This isn't the race I trained for. But for better or worse, this is the race I'm in. And so then she runs, and she completes the marathon at 42 in 4 hours and 2 minutes, like for the first time ever, which is both really impressive and a little bit depressing as well, isn't it? If you're like me. For some of you, you may feel that whatever you're in tomorrow, it's not the race you trained for, it's not the race you entered, but for better or worse, it's the race you're in, and God would have you there. He may call you to something else tomorrow, next week, next year, but for now you are where you are, and he would have you there and call you to be fruitful. There's a guy I met called Claude in my work, who was a mechanic in the Royal Air Force, in the Air Force. And he didn't want to be a mechanic in the Air Force. He wanted to do a proper job for God. So he prayed to God, look, God, lead me to a proper job for you. I want to be a minister. I want to be a pastor for you. And then he felt God say to him, I have planted you here to touch people's lives. And he realized that the job he did saved people's lives. That he could bless people in the suppliers and the colleagues that he worked with in the Air Force. And it totally changed his working life. So what this means for me is that the sermon that counts the most is the sermon that we all preach when we go from here. I love this quote by Theodore Culier, who says, a sermon in shoes is much more eloquent than a sermon on paper. Now, Theodore Collier was from the States, and it's like way more than 100 years ago. He was born 1822 to 1909, and he believed in preaching. He was a great preacher from all accounts, Presbyterian minister. He preached against slavery and was one of the foremost people to do that. He was almost certainly the first person to invite a woman to preach in any Presbyterian church in the States. He absolutely believed in preaching, but he wanted his congregation to know the sermon that counts the most is the one that we all preach with our lives wherever we go from here. So if one danger is we follow society's view of what fruitfulness is, another danger is even if we think of fruitfulness, we think about it just being here in the gathered church. And this is in every good work, in everything that we do. So then we think outside, and then there's still a further danger if we're thinking about fruitfulness tomorrow, that we think of fruitfulness only in terms of evangelism, only in terms of telling other people about Jesus. Now that's vital and it's important, but it's not the only way to be fruitful. So think of a tomato in that sense. Now, we often think of tomatoes as a vegetable, but of course, actually, they're a fruit. They develop from the flower of a plant, and they contain seeds. There's an old joke, isn't there, about knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a vegetable, wisdom is not putting it in a fruit salad. Thank you for not laughing, I know it's an old joke. But the idea is that there's more than one way to be fruitful here. So fruit for us tomorrow is any consequence, because it refers to every good work, any consequence that is in line with his will. When it says, so that you may live a life worthy, and why I like the shoes quote, is that literally in Greek what it's saying is, so that your walk may be worthy of him. But walk is used in a moral sense. And so wherever your feet take you in the coming week, live a life worthy of him. So any animal properly cared for, any pond cleaned up, any person saved, any person healed or fed, any cup of water given, anyone taught or corrected or defended, anyone loved in a godly way, all those things are fruitfulness. We researched this in the organisation that I work for with some young adults in the first 10 years of working life, and they thought exactly that. They thought they weren't being that fruitful in their lives because they weren't telling people about Jesus every day. And when we investigated what they were doing loads of things that were fruitful. And so in the end, we did develop this thing called 6 M's, which is a whole course, which I'm not going to put you through now. But I'm going to list these 6 M's to you as prayers, because they're all different ways to be fruitful. And my prayer is that if our response to that verse is that we want to live fruitfully, that different ones of these M's will resonate with different ones of us. And then we'll pretty much be there in terms of a close. So the first M is to model godly character. To model godly character. That's being fruitful. And so the prayer for that would be, Lord, on my front line, on the place where I'm spending most time, help me to show your character this week. Because he is the King of Kings. And then to make good work. And the prayer for that would be, Lord, in my everyday tasks, in my everyday work, paid or unpaid, help me to work as though it were you I was serving. Because ultimately it is. That's being fruitful. That's walking the walk in a fruitful way. And then to minister grace and love. And my prayer would be, Lord, whatever comes my way, help me to convey the grace and love you have shown me to those around me this week. And then moulding culture. Lord, whatever my front line is, help me to influence the culture around me so that more people can flourish for you. And then mouthpiece for truth and justice. Lord, Help me to be a champion for the right thing, for living fairly and living well with all that goes on my front line, on the place where I spend most time this week, and to be a messenger of the gospel. Lord, give me confidence and more opportunities to talk about you with the people you have placed on my front line. That last one is absolutely important. It's vital. I would argue that the strength of that last one depends actually on the other 5. Like if you're not doing a good job, if you're not moulding culture, if you're not ministering grace and love, and then you try and tell people about Jesus, you kind of water down the message of Jesus. If you do the other 5 and you're not prepared to ask for opportunities to give a reason for the hope that we have, then you're selling short the King of Kings that we have. So it's all of these. And there's an increasing amount of research that shows, very recent research that shows people are interested spiritually. And then once they know we're Christians, they will watch all of those things. And they're not expecting perfect, but they are expecting a difference. In the churches that I connect with, I heard about loads and loads, hundreds actually, of baptisms last Sunday. And loads of people coming to faith in Jesus last Sunday. And that's wonderful. And that depends on an invitation from people very often. And so maybe part of those M's, alongside being a messenger of the gospel, is to invite people to church, being brave to invite them sometimes. Please don't say somebody else's no for them. We can pre-say a no for them. I'm not going to invite them because they're probably going to say no anyway. Let them say no, but give them a good invite. In my church, we led a church for 24 years down on the south coast. Somebody came to faith on Easter Sunday, and it was wonderful. And they were invited, but then they didn't actually live very close to our church. So later on, they joined another church, and they got baptized there. But we showed that baptism in our church, because that counts as our baptism, I think. I don't care what church they go to, and I know Henry wouldn't either. If you want to invite somebody and they say, I live too far away, Henry would want to say, go with them for a few weeks and then come back here, but go with them, encourage them to be part of that church. But when you unpack that, I think it was an invitation, but I know it was, but I think it was also all 6 M's. So there was 2 people working together. One goes to our church, and there was another colleague of hers, and this colleague was in pain through some things that went wrong at the dentist, constant pain, and she wanted to talk about belief and things. And every time other people left the office, they talked for a bit. And our friend who is in our church, she was modelling all of these things. And then people would leave and they talk a bit more, and then she'd come to her house for coffee and they talk a bit more, and in the end they invited her to church on Easter Sunday, and she gave her life to Jesus on Easter Sunday. But it wasn't just that last M, it was all 6 M's. And that is the message and the challenge for each of us, to try to model those things. So just have one last look at that list before I read the verse again as a prayer. And let me ask you, if there's one of those, is there one of those that God is calling you to particularly think about and pray for in the coming week? It could be that that's what you ask prayer for after the service. It can be a simple prayer. Yeah, I want making good work. I want to recognize God as my boss, or whichever one it is. Okay. So here's the prayer again. I'll read it as we close. If the band want to come and join me, be ready to go. And then I'll introduce communion as we do that. But this is a prayer you could be praying for each other this week and for yourself. And I'm particularly thinking about the "so that" bit of this prayer from verse 10. For this reason, since we heard about you, we've not stopped praying for you. We continually ask God to fill you with the knowledge of his will through all wisdom and understanding that the Spirit gives, so that you may live a life worthy of the Lord. That's the bit about walking, wherever your walk takes you. And please him in every way, bearing fruit in every good work, growing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, so that you may have great endurance and patience, and giving joyful thanks to the Father, who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of his holy people in the kingdom of light. Amen.